The newsagents.
It's Christmas. Or is that to come? It certainly is for the newsagents, because we here love nothing more than an election. Yes, you heard that right at the back. An election. And when all the dry as dust, horrible turkey, Christmas puddings and mince pies have been gorged and the mulled wine imbibed, we will at least have the solace of looking ahead to a new year, which is absolutely election-tastic. 2024 will see more democracy, warts and all, imperfections and all, than any other year in human history. There will be elections in over 50 countries, 75% of the democracies around the world, with more than 2 billion people in places as distant as the United States, India, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, all heading to the polls. It's an accident of the calendar. We've never seen anything quite like it. There are concerns about it playing into global political instability, the merry-go-round of leaders changing at a time when many of our strongest democracies have never felt so fragile. We in the UK will almost certainly be voting ourselves, but of course that is our bread and butter, and spoilers, we will be doing a lot of it next year. So on this, the last main edition of the show for 2023, indulge us as we look ahead to what's to come in 2024 around the rest of the world. In each place, what's at stake, what might change, why it matters to us. It's Lewis here. Welcome to the Newsagents.
The newsagents.
Right, before we get to that catalogue of what's to come, a little bit on what's just passed. You will remember that we covered extensively on the show Rishi Sunak's proposed changes to immigration rules, a week or so ago, hailed at the time by the man himself in the House of Commons as some of the toughest ever.
Mr. Speaker, I said enough is enough, and I mean it, and that means I am prepared to do what must be done.
Well, it turns out they weren't quite so tough after all. You'll remember that one of the most controversial elements was the government's announcement that the income threshold someone would need, even British citizens would need, to bring a spouse to the UK would increase from £18,600 to over £38,000, so as to reduce the number of people coming in. Just before the Christmas holidays, we learn that that isn't going to happen after all, or at least not in full. Well, we're joined now by Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor. She was actually with the Home Secretary yesterday. Natasha, isn't it amazing that this big change to government policy, something that had been announced with a great fanfare, a week or so ago, just snuck out a couple of nights before the Christmas holidays?
I know, it's terrible. We've been pressing the Home Office for such a long time for us to have clarity on some of these proposals that James Cleverly, the new Home Secretary, set out just a few weeks ago. Just a few days into the job, actually, he said he was going to cut the legal migration numbers by around 300,000 a year. And they essentially said they were going to do that in part by raising the salary threshold for people who want to bring a spouse or a family member over to the UK. Last night, slipped out quite late, around sort of 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening, not even a press release. It was literally just a document uploaded on the government website and the Home Office saying, hey, actually, it's not going to be 38,500 anymore. It's going to be around 29,000. So quite a row back. The good news that the government did also put out last night was that if you are already here on a visa, on a family partner visa or a skilled worker visa, you should not have to reapply under the new rules if you need a new visa or if you need to extend your visa. So that should be some relief for families. And we've been asking the Home Office for such a long time to clarify this. So that is one bit of good news that has come out from this very last minute announcement from the Home Office.
Why do you think they've done it, Natasha? Because you say it was to such great fanfare. It was hailed by Sunak as kind of some of the toughest laws on immigration anywhere in the world. And yet here we are, quite a significant part of it has been diluted.
Part of it was just the backlash from some Conservatives. You had some MPs saying that they didn't think it was a Conservative policy at all to risk splitting up families. And I don't think the government, the Home Office, were ever going to do that. But I think they realised that maybe it could have an economic impact. I think, going this big jump from around 18,000, the salary threshold, going up from that, doubling it essentially to around 40,000 was just too much of a big step to do all in one go. So the government says they're going to phase this approach up now. We do not have an end date for when it will actually reach this 38,500. And I think, the backlash from Tory MPs, and also that the government said they were going to face a legal challenge over it as well. So I'm sure that probably factored in their thinking too. But yes, I think this is just a classic case of the government just did not think through all of these potential outcomes that could have come out of this and just did not clarify what the rules really meant, causing so much worry for so many people just ahead of Christmas. Not a great look.
But of course, Natasha, you mentioned the left of the party. But in doing this, the right of the party have been really incensed, haven't they? Jonathan Gullis, who is on the right of the party, has tweeted, I noticed, legal migration to the UK is too high and unsustainable. That's why the government was right to introduce tough and necessary new measures to get the numbers down. This decision is deeply disappointing and undermines our efforts. And after all, he does need all wings of the party on side, or most of them anyway, in order to get his Rwanda legislation through next year.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak, as ever, torn between the two wings of his party. Yeah, we've had Jonathan Gullis, we've had Miriam Cates, both on the right of the party, saying the government has promised to cut the numbers. And I think this is an important issue, and it goes right to the heart of Rishi Sunak's balance, trying to keep everybody in his party happy, is that they have promised to cut the numbers, but they've also promised to grow the economy. And the Conservatives know that in order to do that, they do need a certain amount of migration to continue to come into the country. So these two things are really at odds with each other. I don't really personally know where Rishi Sunak stands on this. He stands up and says tough things in the House of Commons to appease his backbenchers, but then he stands up to businesses and says, we want you guys to be able to come to Britain freely on business visas if you want to. So which is it? He can't have it both ways. And, you know, with the migration numbers hitting a record high, 730,000, I think it was, in 2022, the government have promised repeatedly to cut the numbers and they haven't delivered. It's a huge issue of trust for many voters. Rishi Sunak has promised to cut it to the levels that he was when he came into office. That's around 230,000. So he's got such a long way to go. And there are Tory MPs today saying, you're not going to meet this promise before the election. We're going to get punished by the electorate, because they're going to turn around and say, well, you promised to cut the numbers repeatedly. You haven't done it. You promised this crackdown. When's it going to come? And now you've watered it down.
Yeah, it speaks to that kind of slightly trolley-like element of his strategy, doesn't it? Always sort of in different places at the same time. Just before we go, you were with, like I said, Cleverly on Thursday, weren't you? I mean, how did he strike you? I mean, obviously he's going to be a pivotal player going into next year, the Rwanda legislation, going up to the general election. How was his spirits? Was he having left the Foreign Office?
I think he's slightly sad to have left the Foreign Office. It was obviously that he really did love. And there have been many jokes at many a Christmas party over the past few days of even the Prime Minister actually ripped out of him.
Yeah, what was that joke Sunak made?
It was something like, well, I'll be relaxing this Christmas like James Cleverly, wishing I was back on a beach like in my previous job or something. But yeah, I think he was generally in quite good spirits. Obviously, he's a bit knackered from 5 weeks in probably one of the toughest jobs in government. So yeah, I spoke to him as part of a visit to see Border Force staff at Luton Airport. I asked him about the Rwanda policy and what he was prepared to change to get it through. He did say it was nearly there. There have been some suggestions that he's looking at, but it's mostly all done. Obviously, that will not be good news for the Tory MPs hoping to try and change it and try and make it watertight and even tougher. He also defended the money that we're spending on migration, lots of money to Rwanda, millions of pounds to France as well. He said, yep, it's worth every penny. Defence of the realm is not cheap. He also revealed, quite interestingly, I thought, that ministers are not in any talks with airlines at the moment. We've had some reports that the airlines have been refusing to send people to Rwanda as part of this deal, but he says that they haven't even started those discussions yet. So even if we can get this Rwanda legislation off the ground, if the Supreme Court or another court doesn't ground it, which airline's going to fly these people to Rwanda in the first place? I think the government are going to face a pretty tough fight on their hands to try and get somebody who will.
I'm going to let listeners in behind the curtain here, Natasha, as we say we try and do on this show. And that's Natasha has had the biggest nightmare before Christmas possible, which is her dishwasher has stopped working. And she's spared a few precious minutes from the fight against that terrible, terrible breakage to talk to us. So we'll let you go back to that, Natasha. Thank you so much. And Merry Christmas. Happy scrubbing.
Thanks so much, Lewis.
Right, now that's done. Let's get to our first 2024 election. And where could we start but the United States? And who else could we really start with? Now, we were thinking about who could we get to talk about the sort of absolute climax election of next year, and indeed an expert on the Americas in general, not just the US election. Who could we possibly get? And so who did I corner in the studio but our very own John Sopel? You thought he was done for Christmas. He's never done.
He never always here working. On a Friday, just quietly, just nudging the tiller a little bit here, a little bit there to keep you on the right sort of track.
I told you to stop nudging my tiller. Anyway, before we go on, because we are going to talk about a few other elections, not just the US, you were North America editor. I mean, how much stuff just out of interest did you do in Canada and Mexico?
Yeah.
Probably a bit in the Caribbean, though. You won't be surprised.
A little bit, not as much. And we used to get a lot of stick.
Did you go to Guatemala very much?
No, unfortunately, I'd love to have gone to Guatemala. But no, I mean, it was North America editor, and realistically, it was the United States of America editor.
Yeah, well, I suppose. Yeah. Well, for our purposes, that's fine. I mean, look, we've got all this enormous number of elections taking place next year. But obviously the king of them all is the US election. The most important one is the US election for reasons that everybody listening to this is intelligent enough to know and understand. So we're a year out. I suppose the big question is, what chance do you think that there is that Trump is not the Republican candidate, A, and B, that Trump, even if he is a Republican candidate, does he definitely make it to Election Day as the candidate?
I mean, there are so many questions and it is so complicated. And we talked about it on the podcast a couple of days ago about following this Colorado ruling. And the stress that the US Constitution is going to be under is going to make the resolution of Bush versus Gore by the Supreme Court in 2000 like the settlement of a playground squabble, because there are so many legal challenges. So let's go through it one by one. First of all, I do think that Donald Trump is unstoppable. As
even with this Haley surge that is sort of...
the Haley surge. If you look at the latest figures in Iowa and New Hampshire, I mean, Trump is polling over 50% in Iowa. Yeah. No one else, and then the rest of the field, and you know, the highest is DeSantis is like 15 or 16%. Yeah. So I do think that Trump is unstoppable as the Republican nominee, unless you get a situation where DeSantis drops out and everyone just rallies around Nikki Haley as the stop Trump candidate, and she finds enough momentum. She's got a lot of money behind her now, and that's quite significant in American politics. But, you know, Jeb Bush had a lot of money behind him when he tried to fight Trump in 2016, and he absolutely fell apart. Because
you reminded me, because I've just been reading this book called American Carnage, which is kind of like the story of the kind of takeover of the Republican Party. And there's so much in it that I had forgotten about the 2016 campaign. There's this like fascinating moment within it where Cruz is trying to get Rubio to drop out. They're about halfway through the primary process. Trump is doing well, but he's not got it locked up. Yeah. And Rubio is still coming in a decent third. And Cruz assumes that he can sort of craft a deal where Rubio would weigh in behind them and the Cruz becomes the kind of stop Trump candidate. And Rubio doesn't do it. And Cruz, who's been interviewed for the book, later says, you know, that was the moment. If there was a moment we could have stopped him, it was then. So it's interesting, the idea that could the Republican Party miss yet another opportunity to finally rid themselves of this guy?
Yeah, well, it never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
True, yeah.
And I don't think they would do it again this time. I think there are too many people who look at themselves in the mirror and think that I could be it. I could be in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm the person. And, you know, Marco Rubio, I remember interviewing him in Georgia in, 2016, early in 2016. He said, Donald Trump is never going to be the president of the United States of America. It's not going to, believe me, it's never going to happen. And, you know, they thought they could stop him and they just completely misjudged it. You know, the Trump narrative is that it was the Democrats who misjudged Trump. No, there were an awful lot of Republicans who misjudged the strength of Trump. So I think that even with all the legal travails before him, he becomes the Republican nominee. I think if there was a court case that reached a conclusion which passed a sentence of imprisonment on Donald Trump, I think then he loses the presidential election, even though constitutionally he could still run. But I still think there are so many questions about Biden, his age, 81 years old. He'll be 82 by the time that, you know, the election comes around and he'd be sworn in. And you just think that the age is showing on him. And so I still think there is an anti-Trump majority in America, particularly after all that's happened on January the 6th and the language that Donald Trump has used since then. So I think there's an anti-Trump majority. But I mean, millions of Americans feel disenfranchised because they don't, frankly, want either Trump or Biden.
I mean, it's an amazing question to consider, right, about American politics and the structures of American politics, that what has gone wrong in the structure of American democracy, the architecture of American democracy, that it could be such that it is highly likely that the two candidates who are going to be presented before the American electorate are the same as last time, and both are two of the least popular candidates in presidential history. And yet, here we are. It's not supposed to work like that, right? In a democracy, on paper, the parties, like, you know, in political science theory, the parties choose the guy who the electorate wants. And in this case, they're presenting to the electorate two people who no one wants, or almost no one wants, apart from some minorities.
America is the acme of liberal capitalism. the customer is always right. The customer gets what the customer wants. And there is no product on the shelf at the moment that the customer wants in terms of who is going to be the next president of the United States of America. And that is an astonishing position. Although there are Democrats who are saying Biden isn't fit to run, we've got to find a replacement. There seems to be no mechanism to do that now. It's too late for people to get on the ballot to challenge. It would have to be something kind of, act of nature, shall we say, on, that Biden is incapacitated in some way and can't run. And then you get a kind of open convention or whatever it is, a brokered convention. And, you don't know, it could become a free-for-all, but that would be messy. With Trump, he becomes the nominee, but is facing huge legal hurdles. And the courts, the judiciary, involved in a presidential election like never before.
Were you there in 2012? I can't remember.
I was there, but I wasn't the correspondent then.
I was just thinking about the extent to which, talk about like democratic fatigue with America, right? Because essentially, if you think back going, it'll be 12 years to the 2012 presidential election, that is basically like the last normal presidential election the Americans had, quote unquote. They're always jamborees, they're always kind of extraordinary events, but like, it didn't feel existential. If Obama had won, if Romney had won, it wasn't existential for American democracy. It wasn't existential for America's place in the world. And yet now we will have had 3, 16, 20 and 24, which have been in different ways and probably in a ever increasing way, existential for American democracy. Do you think that the 24 is the most important one of the 3?
Yes, I think that it's absolutely critical because I think we have already seen the language that Donald Trump using about I will be a dictator on the day one, and it's going to be the vengeance tour, where he's trying to settle scores with those people who tried to pull him down, those people who voted against him to convict him in the Senate, like Mitt Romney, as you've just mentioned, or those people in the House of Representatives who had it in for him. He's going to want to settle scores. The other thing is that he has assembled this time. Remember, in that period after Donald Trump won the presidential election in 2016, before inauguration in January 2017, he was trying to assemble a cast list of thousands of people, to not just to be the Secretary of State or to be the Defense Secretary or to be whatever it happened to be, Homeland Security. And he didn't really know who these people were. You have to also attract who's going to be my chief of staff. You're appointing thousands of people.
And he was an ingenue. He didn't know any of these people.
He didn't know anything.
Yeah.
He does now.
Yeah.
And he knows he wants people who are not going to be the grown-ups in the room like General John Kelly was when he was the chief of staff, or H.R. McMaster when he was the national security advisor. He doesn't want people who are going to tell him you can't do that. He wants people who are going to say, yeah, go for it. Go for it, Donald. You're absolutely right. And that poses a real serious threat to America, because we know what Donald Trump wants. He says it out loud what he wants. He wants to be a more authoritarian, a more powerful president who has to worry less about Congress, who can stamp on the judiciary. He doesn't like the 3 co-equal branches of government.
Well, this is the point, isn't it? Is that we are in a very different place, and it is a different Trump and a different Republican Party than it was when you were there, covering those early days and weeks when he took over, which seemed kind of revolutionary at the time, and they were. But the point is the kind of process of radicalization of American politics, Trump's own political journey is so much further along than it was in those days in 16 and 17.
Look, the Republican Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of Trump Enterprises.
And that wasn't true in 16.
And it wasn't true in 16. There were independent voices who would kind of balk, and gradually the people that he's appointed, the people that are now close to him, are fully Trumpian, and a Republican Party that is terrified of him. So does the 2024 election in the United States of America matter? It matters colossally, and not just for America, it's for the rest of the world as well. It's about the Western alliance, it's about our relations, the special relationship between Britain and the United States, it's about its relationship with Europe, it's about Asia Pacific. All of those things
he could pull out of NATO
play
this time.
Oh,
he could.
completely.
That was always like something talked about a bit, but he was still on the leash. He wanted to, but he was on the leash.
But he was on the leash, and he was
that.
dissuaded, by the Jim Mattises of this world, and they kind of stayed in their jobs. Jim Mattis was the defense secretary. They stayed in their jobs because they thought they were the grown-ups in the room who would just be able to curb him from doing, exercising his worst instinct. those people won't be there next time round. They will be surrounded by enablers, not people who want to block him. And that means that everything is up for grabs.
Any other elections in the Americas taking your eye, John, next year? I mean,
Well-
as the former North America editor of the BBC.
Look, you've got elections in Mexico as well.
Ah,
I always loved it.
That's the stable one now.
I always loved it when British politicians would go over, prime ministers, they'd always want to hear the president talking about the special relationship, which the president did, because
Yeah,
they knew that
that's what he
plays
sold.
well in the UK, and you've got to say the special relationship
Helps
to
out
pat the
the
British
PM.
on the head. When Mexico's in town, it's our closest relationship.
Our closest relationship.
Because, of course,
right, yeah.
geographically, Canada and Mexico are the closest. Look, you've had President Obrador in power for the past few years. He, a leftist, but has been much more pragmatic, where there has actually been pretty good relations. And Mexico is a huge, powerful economy
Yeah.
in terms of manufacturing, in terms of drugs, in terms of all sorts of things. And by drugs, I mean pharmaceuticals
Yeah.
rather than anything else. But I mean, there are also problems there. So the bilateral relationship is really important there. And it looks like it's going to be a woman, the first woman president in Mexico, because the two main candidates are women. And it looks like it's going to be a woman called Claudia Sheinbaum, who is from the Morena party, the same as President Obrador. She's got a huge poll lead at the moment. Former mayor of Mexico City, scientist, academic, and from a very interesting background. And it looks like she is kind of set to inherit the throne, which I suspect will mean more continuity.
So Mexico is going to have a woman president before the United States, and it's legalized abortion just at the point where the United States has moved to have some of the strictest abortion laws in the Western world.
You cannot believe how many people are crossing the border at Tijuana, just south of San Diego, to go into Mexico to have their abortions because of the new laws, because of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So thousands of women are going into Mexico. And you know, it's interesting. There is an awful lot of really interesting business in Mexico, where people are looking to buy more and more goods from Mexico. It's doing really well as an economy and a big, important neighbour of the United States.
Crazy world. John, we should probably let you go for Christmas now.
Oh, I thought we were going to talk about the Venezuelan
Oh, well, yeah.
elections.
Have you got
And
Venezuela as well?
And Mia Motley as the next UN Secretary General.
All right, go on. Well, give us quickly about Venezuela.
Well, they could also have a woman candidate as well to be president, Maria Machado, except she's been disqualified from running in that bastion of democracy that is now run by President Maduro. Disqualified. So I think that the chances are that it will be Maduro again as president.
Well, who'd have thought it?
Yeah.
Not one of the fairer elections that's probably going to go on next year.
No, I don't think
Probably
election monitors need not bother to turn up. I think we know that this election is going to be stitched up.
And actually, it really matters in terms of, because the conflict that's going on at the moment between Venezuela and Guyana is actually a real source of instability at the moment. There's a border dispute going on. Basically, it looks like Venezuela is going to annex some islands which are part of Guyana. And although we don't hear a lot of in terms of instability from South America, actually in terms of next year, it's one of those stories that could really, really flare up. So it actually really matters, that election. And with that, John, we'll send you on your merry way. Onto your sleigh. Comet, Vixen. And those are just the girls you met this year. Anyway.
Yeah,
Boom.
boom.
Cheers, John.
Bye.
Right, when we come back, we will talk all things Europe. Stay with us.
This is The Newsagents.
Right, we're joined to discuss all the elections happening in Europe next year by the one and only Matt Fry, Channel 4 anchor, Europe editor for Channel 4 News, and LBC presenter, an all-round news legend. So, Matt, it's a big year for elections everywhere. It's a big year for Europe, including Britain, but we're not trying to sort of steer away from Britain because everyone knows about that. What elections in what they used to call the continent have you got your eye on for next year?
Well, I mean, I think it's 50 elections next year across the world, the biggest test of democracy in a generation, perhaps more. And oddly enough, and ironically enough, it is also the year in which, democracy might die, yet another slow death in some parts of the world, most notably, of course, the United States. I think for Europe, the issue really, and which will come to the fore in the European elections in the summer, is to what extent an institution, call it a club, based on democratic values, will see those values further eroded by the far-right parties that have already done very well in national elections, doing even better in European elections. And I think this is where we're talking about some crucial issues that have been vexing, politicians in this country for some time, notably through things like Brexit, have been propelling people like Marine Le Pen to the forefront of politics in France. But really, they've come to a head now, thanks to events in Italy, in the Netherlands, and of course in Hungary.
And I know, of course, you keep a very close eye on German politics and talk to German political players a lot. Germany doesn't have an election, a federal election next year. That won't be until September 2025. But there are, as always in Germany, there'll be a series of sort of Länder elections and local elections. And we have, of course, seen, and the thing that everyone is talking about in German politics at the moment is the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. They just won their first mayoralty the other day. How worried are German political players you're talking to about AfD?
They're terrified, and they don't really have an answer. And if you think about it, the AfD, again, is a relatively new political movement in the German landscape. And it started off, 15, 20 years ago, as an anti-Euro party brought to life by a number of Eurosceptic professors who thought that you could never have a European monetary union without a fiscal union. And they therefore thought, to deprive the Deutschmark of its glory and its independence and wrap it into the euro was a really, really bad idea. And that then morphed into an anti-immigrant party that did so well in the 2017 federal elections. They became the third biggest party in the Bundestag. But now, as you've alluded, they are the most popular party in the eastern states, scoring about 30%, in some places even more. They are the second most popular party in the whole country, scoring about 20%. Behind the CDU. And what has happened is that they have filled a hole left by the Christian Democrats who've moved, under Merkel, had moved further to the left. And they filled a hole that is left by the big political parties getting together for far too long in a grand coalition. So if the big political parties, the Social Democrats, the SPD and the CDU, the Christian Democrats, kind of converge on the center ground, when there are some very tribal social economic issues at play, of course, it erodes their authority. And then you lay on top of that the end of the social contract of the Federal Republic, which is, security and constantly rising prosperity, which we've seen all over Europe, the onset of more austerity, less state funding, higher taxes, then another layer of the war on woke. You mess with a relationship between a German citizen and his Mercedes or BMW, and you're in big trouble. So this whole, thing that we've seen in London as well, and making people pay for environmental reform, which is, of course, necessary, but doing so has been incredibly unpopular with a very large number of German voters. And the AfD has managed to weaponize that as well.
And of course, there is one presidential election next year, which in a way is important, but where the stakes are high, but the electoral stakes are very low, i.e. we will definitely know the result. And that is Russia and Putin's re-election. Obviously, they have once again sort of changed the constitutional limits. What's your assessment of where Putin is going to be in 2024?
Well, that depends entirely, I think, on two things, and the election is one of them. It depends on to what extent he can keep on not losing the war in Ukraine, and to what extent he can keep on rejigging the Russian economy to become a war economy. And I think on both fronts, he's been quite successful. And it's very hard to see the Ukrainians, with all the help they're getting from the West, and some of that is, of course, diminished, making such a breakthrough that it causes a clinical, critical enfeeblement of Vladimir Putin. I can't see that happening, to be honest. So he will carry on making money from oil and gas exports through the back door, and there are plenty of countries that are helping him to do so, Azerbaijan, Turkey. The Russian economy has not been hit nearly as badly by sanctions as we thought. The Russian population seems to, through a combination of censorship and fear and actual genuine patriotism and loathing of the Ukrainian enemies, so to speak, and loathing of NATO and the West, has rallied behind him. Surprisingly, when you consider that, according to the Americans at least, something like 300,000 Russian servicemen have been killed in this conflict. That is an astonishing number. And yet they're still being sent to the front line. Russian babushki mothers are not keeping their boys locked at home in the cellar for fear of being sent to the war. So I think Putin is, bar some sort of divine intervention, or some extraordinary breakthrough from the Ukrainians, is probably going to just carry on.
And no prospects of any internal political opposition, another Navalny type figure, sort of at least coalescing around the election?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the liberal opposition has either, left the country, they're either in exile or they're in jail, or some of them are dead. And we don't even know at the moment where Navalny is. His whereabouts are not certain. He may have been sent somewhere to a detention facility somewhere in Siberia. He has been literally disappeared. If anything, there might be opposition from the extreme right, people even less pleasant than Vladimir Putin. But because Putin has managed to stabilize the economy and stabilize the front in Ukraine, that opposition, that extreme right opposition that always said, you're not being hard enough on Ukraine, you should be using bigger and better weapons, I think they've also disappeared to some extent. And crucially, the war, in Gaza between Israel and Hamas has muddied the waters when it comes to America's claim to be leading a sort of moral charge of democracy against autocracy to such an extent that has also helped Vladimir Putin. I mean, Vladimir Putin is perhaps the biggest beneficiary of the Gaza-Hamas war because it's detracted attention both in terms of military funding, financial aid from Ukraine. It has undermined Biden's attempt at the moral high ground to say, this is beating Hamas and beating Moscow are one and the same thing. Many people in the global south who weren't, frankly, on board when it came to Russia in the first place and sanctions are saying, hang on a minute, you cannot equate these two. So I think actually everything has conspired in the last few months, Lewis, to put a bigger smile on Vladimir Putin's face. And ultimately, that is really bad news, especially if Donald Trump gets elected in the United States.
I was going to say, Matt, just finally, to go back to exactly where you started, which is that so many elections around the world, so many really important elections, none more important than the United States. And to link it back to Russia, how worried do you think we should be about the prospects of interference, particularly in the US elections, but other elections as well, perhaps our own election? And when we consider how important that might have been in 2016 and the tools at Russia's disposal are even greater now with the rise of sort of AI, deepfakes and so on, how worried about Russian interference should we be?
I'm actually less worried about it than I was in the past because we know the danger. We know that it might be coming. I think people are going to be alert to it, even though the technology has improved in terms of faking people's voices and faces. I think we're more alert to it than we were. And I also honestly think that it's wrong to think that Russian interference in 2016 was what ultimately helped Trump to win that election. It was a combination of other factors, not least, his ability to kind of do retail politics in his own strange way and Hillary Clinton's inability to do the same thing. I think the bigger issue is that there are many players around the world who are literally waiting for Donald Trump to get into office so they can do some really bad stuff, while everyone else is distracted. Russia, obviously, is one of them. They have a lot to gain from that. But it could also be, Modi, who's facing his own elections in India this year as a Hindu nationalist, trying to do things internally in India that are deeply unpleasant, that he might think he can get away with if Trump, who had a love-in with Modi, literally as his last kind of act as president, the massive rally for Trump in one of the big cricket stadiums, the Narendra Modi Stadium, I think, in India, which Trump loved because it was 200,000 people. So all these autocrats, either real autocrats or would-be autocrats, are kind of waiting for Trump to get in. They may be horribly disappointed. We just don't know what's going to happen in America. But the fact that they're waiting for him to get in, the fact that they are, ready to unleash a whole set of policies on their own people and possibly some wars against their neighbors, that should be deeply alarming to all of us.
Matt, thank you so much. Have a very Merry Christmas.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Now, Matt mentioned India there, the world's biggest democracy. Huge election coming up there next spring. It's going to be important for India, South Asia and the world. To discuss it, we're joined by Avani Dias, who is ABC's South Asia correspondent from Australia. Avani, thanks so much for coming on. Obviously, in terms of South Asia next year, the big one is India. Just talk us through what the general election, the contours of it, the players, Modi seeking re-election and so on.
It's such a big one because Narendra Modi has had such an interesting 10 years where he's really solidified power and become this huge popular leader in India. He's made ordinary Indians feel empowered. He's driven economic policies which have made people feel like their day-to-day lives are improved. Whether or not that's the actual case on the ground is another case, but the thing is that people really do connect to him in a big way, and he's really put India on the map on a global scale and interestingly made ordinary people care about that. But at the same time, his critics are really concerned about policies which they say are targeting minorities, especially the Muslim community in India. And there are concerns about the backsliding of democracy and what's going on in India in that sense. So what is happening now is we've seen Modi win in the 2019 election with this huge majority in parliament, right? And we're coming up to this election where he's feeling strong. But what's really fascinating is in the last couple of months, we've seen more than 20 opposition parties actually unite and come together for the first time in this effort to defeat Modi. So now they're in this really interesting situation where they're trying to figure out who will be the face of their election. Will it be the main opposition, the Congress, and Rahul Gandhi, who comes from this dynasty family? But Congress is facing a few issues. But the interesting thing is that they have come together, and people are saying, well, this could actually be a challenge for Modi going forward.
Just for people who aren't that familiar with Indian politics, what is it about Modi that is so controversial, why he is such a kind of checkered figure in some ways? And as you say, some people, he's a figure who inspires adoration from some, but absolute loathing from others. What is it about him that is so controversial?
Well, Modi has such an interesting backstory, right? He has these roots in this organisation called the RSS, which is effectively the largest far-right organisation in the world. And it has very extreme ideologies around it about this idea that India is a Hindu-first state, that originally it is for Hindu people, that its religion and everything around it should be about Hinduism. And there are elements of the RSS which have used violence in the past in order to put forward that ideology as well. And so this is a really interesting past. And now Modi is in the major party, which is the sort of political wing of the RSS. They're not directly associated, but they are connected in many ways. And he has been pushing forward that same ideology, this idea that India is a Hindu country. And that's despite the fact that India is, in its constitution, a secular nation. It's actually the country with the largest Muslim population in the world. There are more than 220 million Muslims in India, and millions, tens of millions of Christians and Sikhs and several other religions, right? So they've been living in this same country for so long. But that idea that Hinduism is the main thing, that's what's really controversial. Now, the other element of this is this idea of what is democracy in India. You know, we see Narendra Modi talking about this idea that India is the mother of democracy, the largest democracy in the world. But even just this week, I've been covering the fact that 141 MPs, opposition MPs, were suspended by Narendra Modi's party in parliament, and 6 bills were introduced without any opposition. I mean, those are the foundations of democracy, right? Debate and discussion within parliament. And that's just one example where we're seeing a lot of concerns about these democratic pillars being threatened under Narendra Modi's leadership.
So would you say that in this general election, this important election, that to some extent at least, the sort of twin concepts, the pillars of Indian democracy itself, but also India's place as a country where minorities feel accepted, that they're part of Indian democracy itself, that those things are to some extent at least on the line?
Definitely, and that's really what's going to be at stake here is, you know, will India continue to be this country that goes down this path as we've seen for the last 10 years? And depending on who you speak to, there are a lot of concerns about what a Narendra Modi victory would mean. Will it mean that he'll be more emboldened to continue down this path, these sort of concerns around democracy and treatment of minorities? Others are saying, well, he's getting pretty old. It could be his last 5 years in power. Will he want to protect his legacy and sort of draw back and become a bit more centrist when it comes to these ideas? So definitely those things are at stake. And whether or not he can be defeated is going to be an interesting question, because I think for ordinary Indians, they're more concerned about things like cost of living. How are they going in terms of poverty? Can they get a roof over their head? And those are the things that a lot of them are voting on. Of course, when it comes to India's elite, there are questions about these issues that we're discussing, but for ordinary Indians, they're concerned about those economic issues, and a lot of them feel protected by Modi in that respect.
Is there any sense in which India's role in the world could be at stake in these elections, in the sense that obviously India, huge geopolitical player, a country which is being courted by the other great powers of the world, China, the United States and so on, Modi, a big figure on the international stage. If Modi were to lose, and he'd be replaced by someone else, would that change India's foreign policy outlook?
Well, it's been so interesting, right? Because perhaps for the first time under Narendra Modi's leadership, India's being taken seriously, as you say, as a geopolitical figure. I mean, I'm originally from Australia, and we've seen Australia-India relations at a height that we have not seen historically. And I think before Modi, a lot of those major players, those Western countries, kind of underestimated India, despite the fact that it is a country of now 1.4 billion people, that it's the fastest growing economy in the world, and so on. There was this idea of, well, India is a country which is struggling through poverty. What can it really offer? And so Narendra Modi's come at this time where the economy is really going well, where the population's just overtaken China's. It's reaching those heights, but Modi has managed to really dictate what kind of place India has on the stage. And interestingly, we don't see this in even Western countries, where he's made ordinary people actually care about the fact that India is now recognized on the global stage. And that's been really fascinating to watch. And so, yes, it will be interesting if there is a new prime minister. Will they be able to keep up that India momentum? My personal thinking is yes, because now India is a place that people just can't ignore. The population is so huge. It's such a young country. It's got such a workforce. And the Indian diaspora in countries like Australia, the UK, the US, and so on, is just so huge that domestically, Western leaders really care about India.
And indeed, it has been a big part of the Ukraine war and India's growing relationship with Russia under Modi. So it matters.
Exactly. And we saw, I was at the G20 meeting in Delhi, and that was such a fascinating situation. We were sitting there all thinking, well, these G20 countries, they hate each other at the moment because of the Russia war. There was this basic consensus that there would be no agreement over Russia. And then along came India and became the middleman. It has strong relations with Russia, it has strong relations with the West, and it managed to bring consensus at the G20 and deliver a joint communique, and that was something people didn't expect.
Avani, thank you so much. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Right, don't think we're done with you yet. There's a lot more of the world to go. Stay with us.
This is The Newsagents.
Now, it's not just Europe or America who are having elections next year. There's lots of other places in other parts of the world. And against my better judgment, we've allowed the studio glass to be broken temporarily by allowing one Gabriel Radis, who is a senior producer. I've been instructed, I must say that, senior producer on the show, who's been having a look through. This is by absolutely no public demand whatsoever, by the way.
A lot of clamour, yeah.
A lot of demand from Gabriel, I think it's fair to say, to do this. Yeah. He's been having a look through some of the other elections. So come on, Gabriel, since it's Christmas and we couldn't get anybody else, where else are having elections that we should be keeping an eye on next year?
A true breaking of the fourth wall.
Yeah.
Which is quite exciting, really.
Yep, one time only.
I mean, there are so many elections. We sort of discussed it with Matt and John earlier. The crucial ones that I thought, I'd pick out and discuss with you. South Africa. I'm South African, so I thought, we've got to talk about the 2024 South African election next year.
Gabriel Mandela Radis, they call you.
They do in some quarters, yeah.
Go on.
It's the first election since 1994 that South Africa could not have the ANC govern it in a majority capacity.
Just to remind people, this is the African National Congress that has dominated South African politics since the end of apartheid.
So before 1994, you had apartheid and you had no universal suffrage. 1994, Mandela's released from prison and so on. And you have universal suffrage, and Nelson Mandela, leader of the ANC, leader of the African National Congress, storms to victory in the election, and the ANC ride high in 1994 all the way through to where we are now, 2024.
Many presidents later. We've had Zuma,
we've had Thabo Mbeki, and so on.
Yeah.
And Jacob Zuma has a lot to play in this. But the reality is now we have Cyril Ramaphosa, who's the South African president right now, who doesn't have an enormous majority and has polled very low. And South Africa is a new democracy with a proportional representative system. So you've got 400 seats and they're polling it between the high 30s and the early 40s.
And this is the parliamentary election.
Yes, the parliamentary election.
Yeah.
But what it does is it means that the ANC, for the first time in its history and for the first time in South African modern history, could not have a majority and may have to rely on far left, extreme left, black nationalist groups like the Economic Freedom Fighters, Marxist-Leninist groups, to prop up their minority government. And failing that, you might have a party like the Democratic Alliance, run by John Steenhuisen, who, I mean, he's not going to win a majority of the seats, but what he could do is partner up, as he has done in a sort of massive bloc, and joined up with parties like the Freedom Front Plus, which is a grassroots political party that was based in white nationalism, leads South Africa with the first white president since F.W. de Klerk, which would be an absolutely extraordinary scenario.
And presumably, either way, this is a time of inflection and a time of internal tension.
Massively. In South Africa as well. I mean, you've got terrible economic downturn. You've got power outages of 6 hours a day on average. You've also got 33% of unemployment in the country. And you've also got quite complicated foreign relations between, South Africa has voted to abstain in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah.
Has been
hosted the BRICS.
With Brazil, Russia,
Putin.
India and China. And whereas before South Africa has sort of been a beacon of democracy in Africa and has been an economic powerhouse, economic downturn, foreign relations pretty sketchy with the West has meant that, to be honest, it doesn't have many friends in the West. You've got the Democratic Alliance, like I said, the centre-right party that is very pro-Ukraine, pro-Israel. And you could see a tide turning. People are just fed up with an ANC that is corruptible, that has been through the courts and has had their former leader, Jacob Zuma, accused of corruption, imprisoned for a couple of months. And you've had plenty of ministers finding plenty of dosh behind their proverbial sofas.
Dosh a technical term?
Could be.
When is that? Just for our calendars? People are obviously marking it off at home at this point.
There's no fixed date yet. But
fine.
It will be in the springtime.
Some point in the springtime. Okay, moving on. Where else are we looking?
So, again, I mean, we can stay in Africa, actually, because...
Well, why not?
We've spent a lot of time talking about Rwanda on this programme, and Rwanda have an election. Now, Rwanda, again, another democracy, sort of democracy.
Although a bit of a question mark over
there. There are, indeed, and the question marks are really interesting. So that was founded in 1994 as well. You've got one leader, Paul Kagame, that has been the president since 2000, who in 2015 held a referendum to say, you know what, don't really fancy leaving. I know you're meant to have 2 terms. Why don't we increase my term limit to 5 terms? That old trick. And let's push that back to starting from 2024, where it can be 5-year terms. So basically, in a country where in that referendum they voted 98% in favour of that in Rwanda, which I mean, has been questioned somewhat. You could have a country in Rwanda that has a leader in Paul Kagame for 34 years in a so-called democracy.
Been president of Rwanda for your whole lifetime, Gabriel.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, quite, and he's only 66. So I mean,
in fact, all of my lifetime is 34. Yeah.
So I mean, you could have a scenario in which, with Paul Kagame, 66 years old now, he could go on to continue to be president for another 10, 11 years, so until 2034.
And this is important, right, as well, in terms of just to bring it back to our own domestic political context, which is that it is obviously the government has an interest in saying that Rwanda is, they often say, a thriving democracy, a place that people should want to go. It's got a booming economy. In fact, sometimes you almost be forgiven for hearing government ministers basically sort of suggest that Rwanda is better than the UK, that these people will be better off in Rwanda. But that is important, because if that election is seen to be unfair or opponents are seen to be persecuted, then that will have people in the UK will notice, and that will have domestic political repercussions.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a de facto one-party state. I mean, it's an incredibly repressive electoral system where basically if you're an opponent of Paul Kagame, you cannot run. And plenty of human rights organisations have found Rwanda guilty of doing away with their political opponents. So, yes, he has. I mean, lots of people say he's done very good for the economy. He's improved certain aspects of society in Rwanda. But fundamentally, if you don't have free and fair elections...
He's doing all right out of us.
Well, yeah, quite.
Yeah. That is a lot of dosh to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the real conundrum. Can you see Rwanda as a safe country if elections there aren't free and fair, if there is a question as to the democratic values of the state?
All right. Any others?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean...
How long is this list, Gabriel? I'm starting to worry. We've all got lives to lead.
Inexorable? No.
Right, okay. I mean, I love an election more than the next man, but we might be taking the piss
do you
here.
like the Palawan general election and the Solomon Islands general election?
Okay,
as well?
I have to say, this is one that I have not been following in great detail. What's
the
going on
Palawan one is actually very interesting, and also the Solomon Islands.
Palau is in case you haven't heard of it, Palau is a very small island.
Yeah, as are the Solomon Islands, really. There are
a few more of those. But
yeah, there are a few more of those, but I mean, there's only about 20,000 people in Palau, spread across about 300 islands.
Used to have a lot of phosphate mining, I believe.
I'll trust you on that.
Yeah.
They both either
We're doing a mining episode over the Christmas New Year period, so that's something to look out for.
Yeah, that's on the 29th.
Yeah.
They're on either side of the Philippines, basically, in the Micronesia sort of area. The interesting
And they
thing
say that podcasts would be about dumbing down. I'll tell you, where else are you going to get Micronesian elections?
and where else are you going to start talking about
Macronesia.
foreign relations and China's impression on the world than on the newsagents? Because Palau and the Solomon Islands are two very interesting subjects of Chinese influence. The Solomon Islands, sovereign is King Charles III,
Yes.
but in July
Part of our
2023,
great Commonwealth family of
part of our
nations.
great Commonwealth, but in 2019 they severed ties with Taiwan and they changed their view and directed it towards Beijing. In 2023 they signed a police cooperation pact whereby they strengthened their relationship with China. And the Palauan people, seeing that from across the Filipino Strait, thought, well, I mean, that if that's the way that we're going to go, we're not all that happy because we have a very strong relationship with the US. We've got an embassy in Washington. So how do we feel about this? Now, to the Palauanese president's credit, Sivangal Whips Jr., he's managed to maintain sovereignty and...
We're doing a My Political Makeup Friday interview with him at some point, I assume.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's very keen. The Palauans are not interested at all in devolving any sort of economic impression to China. But the Chinese have tried. But on a pure sort of objective look at both of those countries' politics, and, you know, Palau is very interesting. They've only got 13 Senate members and 16 House delegates. All of them have to stand as independents. It's such a small country.
Yes.
No political parties exist. And the Solomon Islands, I mean, you've got far greater sort of scope there, but their president...
How do you run an election in the Solomon Islands? That'd be fascinating.
I know.
It might be something we could suggest as a potential send for next year as part of our election.
I'm very
coverage.
keen.
Are you up for it?
Yeah, I mean, look...
Capital of the Solomon Islands, Gabriel?
I actually don't know.
Oh, there, your research has run out now, hasn't it, son?
It has.
Well, all that Honiara.
Honiara.
So that's where we're going next year. I have to say, well, thank you for that. I have to say, our editor, our esteemed editor, Mr. Tom Hughes, is usually quite reluctant that we do anything even on politics, like French politics, let alone Solomon Islands. So I'm glad. I'm not sure how he'll feel about this.
No, not at all.
All right. Well, the sandaled psephologist himself here in the studio, Gabriel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, well, I promise you, we will never inflict that upon you again. Gabriel, I mean, we'll be doing plenty of elections, of course. Democracy has never had a bigger year. And neither have we. Our first full one on the newsagents. It has been such a pleasure to have your company this year. John, Emily and I, the whole team, are just so grateful to you for making us a part of your days. Because it's Christmas, we can be schmaltzy and say that it is a real privilege. Talking of John and Emily, they send their apologies for not being with us today. They have been making a list, checking it twice, and simply couldn't be found. But if you're missing them too badly, fear not, because we've got a couple of special episodes dropping over the Christmas holiday, so do keep an eye out for those. And if you fancy something really festive, don't forget you can listen to my special investigation episode on the relentless rise of the far right. You'll find that from last Sunday in the feed. Thanks to our production team on the newsagents, the best in the business: Prancer Raidus, Donna Fitzpatrick, Vixen Foxwell, Cupid Barnett, Dasher Simon, Comet Fenley, and Blitzen Bardewell. Our editor is Tom Rudolph Hughes. It's presented by Emily, already bored on holiday Maitlis, John, I'm going to stop swearing in the New Year, Sopel, and me, Lewis Goodall. Have a wonderful Christmas, or as the great Richard Osman once said, if Christmas is hard for you, then have a peaceful one.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.